So I am here with Dan HoSang, who's a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale University. I'm Matthew Jacobson, a professor of American Studies and the acting co-director of the Public Humanities program. As a start, Dan, could you just talk about the architecture of your new book, the book that you co-authored with Joe Lowndes? You guys gave a really great presentation at the public library last week, and can you just kind of walk us through the architecture of the book and what you're trying to do in this particular take on white nationalism or white supremacism in the contemporary United States?
Great. Well, thanks, Matt, for having me. The book is called Producers, Parasites, and Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. And we began writing it right after the Great Recession in 2009 or so, 2010, in the context of these growing attacks against public sector unions, public employees. So in Wisconsin, figures like Governor Scott Walker were really holding that it was these employees and their incessant demands for benefits, for pensions, that were actually the culprit of this economic crisis. And we were struck that the language they were using to represent the public sector workers, and these are teachers, they're toll booth collectors, janitors, social workers, really harkened back to a deeply racialized discourse of what we called parasitism. This is drawing from work by colleagues Chip Burlett and Matthew Lyons, in which these largely white government employees are represented as dependent, diminished, sucking the labor off of the hardworking taxpayers. And for us as scholars of 20th and 21st century racial politics, this represented a somewhat distinct turn. That language has often been reserved for people of color, women of color in particular, in the context of welfare, immigration, et cetera. At the same time, we were noticing a certain incorporation of a small but significant number of figures on the far right of both the Republican Party and kind of the U.S. political culture in general. So we're talking here about figures like Congresswoman Mia Love, Senator Tim Scott, other African Americans in the GOP who increasingly became the kind of exemplars of a market-based philosophy, a kind of militarism, patriarchal commitments. The argument being that if these figures could demonstrate the potency of markets, the free market economy, to really restore the nation, address economic crisis, that they best stood in for those politics. So those were the two conditions that kind of led us to begin writing the book.
Great. And can you just walk us through what you end up arguing and how you put that argument together?
Yeah. Well, we take these two figures of the producer, which has a long, long history in U.S. political culture, back to the very legitimation of the transatlantic slave trade, of indigenous conquest, colonial expansion, the notion that some among us are uniquely suited to be the producers, while others, incapable of that labor, are the dependents and the parasites. And so we trace the transformations of those categories, first through this discourse attacking white public sector workers. We turn then to a series of conservative thinkers, conservative and liberal thinkers, who are arguing that after the recession in particular, that the kind of growth of precarity in largely white communities, working class communities, rural communities, Appalachia as the kind of stand-in for that, have actually come to take up many of those characteristics, again, previously asserted with communities of color and poor communities in particular. So we look at, for example, the National Review and the way they describe Appalachia as a kind of failed cultural kind of morass of deep moral crises in those communities. The third chapter looks at that incorporation in the GOP in particular of particularly African American figures, again, a small but significant number, asking why it would be figures like Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, who would be so popular among white Tea Party supporters, not just to indemnify themselves from charges of racism, which is a more familiar explanation, but actually because they testify to the unique and distinctive project of anti-state conservatism. A fourth chapter, which we describe as the multiracial character of the far right, which looks at formations like Patriot Prayer, the Proud Boys, and the incorporation in particular of men of color in those groups and the work that their presence does to kind of shore up a certain right-wing politics. The final chapter is on the militia takeover in Eastern Oregon in 2015 and 2016, where we're trying to take up these questions on the one hand that in many of those communities, largely white but not exclusively white, we're seeing the same levels of state abandonment, crisis, and precarity that have long been familiar on the border, in places like Ferguson, Baltimore, Detroit, working-class black communities. High unemployment, what other sociologists have described as deaths of despair, kind of a deep morass and struggle. The militia groups enter into that moment, and they're trying to figure out how to use that crisis to rejuvenate a certain kind of producerist politics, to reclaim the land, to expel the federal government. And we argue that what's key there is not just critiquing them and critiquing the violence and fascism of their politics, but understanding the underlying relationships that give rise to those formations in the first place.
Great, thank you. So you said you started out in 2009. It's been a fascinating slice of time in the United States between 2009 and now, kind of thinking about Obama's America and Trump's America. How do you understand this period in American history? As someone, you've written about the long 20th century. You've written a lot over the years about race and political culture along a pretty long stretch of the timeline in American history. Where are you in your thinking about how we get from 2009 to where we are now, and what this slice of time kind of looks like in the long historian's perspective?
Yeah, well, our colleague Daphne Brooks was here talking about Toni Morrison and her long legacy of not just literary work, but political analysis. And I returned recently to a speech she gave in 1995, Howard University, the commencement speech. Our colleague Rod Ferguson shared this with me. And she talked really about how fascism and racism, she said fascism as the succubus twin of racism, had this capacity to take root in many, many different political cultures, nations, and contexts. And what was important for her about this was its recurring tropes of demonization and of turning people who might otherwise be oriented towards one another's care and possibility and humanity, into different kind of subjects. Taxpayers, consumers, people who would be suspicious of one another, people who would want to participate in that purging. She said even to the point where people would be acting against the interests of their own children. And this is, in the mid-'90s, a time of, it's not a period of economic crisis. Clinton is in the White House. So I think, returning to that 15 years ago reminds us that while Trump is the figure now that we're associating with a certain kind of violence, a collapse of political trust, a foreclosure of possibility, that those impulses and that kind of tradition of turning any of us into subjects that might want to be on the lookout for that group, that neighbor, that movement that represents crisis and failure and must be expelled, has always been with us. And the fact that we're seeing it transform to some extent, such that we have something like a multiracial far right in this country, we can understand as a certain extension of these traditions of fascism and white supremacy, rather than some dramatic departure from them. So Malcolm X once said, I think, that racism is like a Cadillac. They come up with a brand new model every year. And I think that's partly what we're seeing, is the ongoing development and dynamism of racial formation in response to growing economic crisis and precarity.
I think that's one of the challenges of our moment is, on the one hand, Trump is absolutely a breaker of norms, and that's how he's gathered his power in the GOP. That's how he's deployed his power from the White House, and we best not lose sight of that. On the other hand, he's not entirely anomalous, and we best not lose sight of that either. I mean, his racism, his kind of false populism, there are many things about him that are actually quite familiar from the long story of American political culture. But that combination is very tough, the combination of the kind of the breaker of norms and the bearer of longstanding kinds of right-wing racist traditions. Does the work that you and Joe have done over the last 10 years suggest antidotes to what we're seeing in our politics right now?
Well, I think we have to take seriously the sets of experiences that figures like Trump but others mobilize in this certain kind of anti-status vision, which is some sense that your welfare, the welfare of your family, your community, your kin, your loved ones, actually the state is either disinterested in or it's participating in the violence that you're experiencing. There's versions of that on the far right, or even just on the right in kind of white identitarian movements, some notion that, the government used to be aligned with your interests and now, look, it's siding with racialized immigrants, et cetera. But there's also a version of that in communities of color and on the left, which takes very seriously the way that the state has abandoned people, hasn't addressed their precarity, hasn't sustained a vision of collectivity and possibility for the future. So that's the ground on which not just Trumpism, but these other kind of street right formations takes root. Some sense that the institutions are indeed failing us, and because of that failure, new, bold, even violent prescriptions are possible. So part of our argument is that to address that, we have to actually think together about visions of relationships, collectivities, a vision of the state that actually is capable of caring, protecting, and allowing people to flourish. And that has to be a vision that links together communities on the border and the crisis on the border in terms of detention and issues of migration, to longstanding Black and brown working class communities that have faced economic and political abandonment, to even other white communities, not just in rural areas, but who have now felt the brunt of those same forces. It certainly doesn't mean that all those experiences and places are equivalent. That's not in any way our argument. But the solution has to be in thinking about what the relationship is between those places and how it might sustain a vision that's not rooted in purging and a kind of diminished role of our collective capacity to care for ourselves.
One of the most daunting things I think about our moment is in thinking through any kind of a solution, whether it's a solution through organizing, through a renewed union politics, a renewed labor movement, or through the party system, whatever the thing is that's going to be the vehicle for redress, that we're faced with, I think, a really deep and deepening epistemological crisis in our country, where it's no longer the case that we're simply disagreeing about policy vision or an interpretation of facts, but we're actually disagreeing as to what the facts are. That we're so, between the cable news driven divisions in the polity and then kind of exacerbated by the internet, there's hardly anything agreed upon as kind of a core fact anymore. So we're starting from a very different place than we were in the era of three networks. How do you think about, you've written a lot about the public sector. How do you think about the fate of the public sector or the public as a kind of abstract principle or even an ideal in this setting where it's not just a matter of polarization, but it's this kind of epistemological divide between what is or can be known?
So I think that's right, and that's a helpful way to think about a certain kind of periodization in genealogy, that at once there was a public, both in terms of the information people would consume, or I should say a more coherent public, the kinds of institutions people lent their consent to, the kinds of projects people were committed to building together. At the same time, we have to remember that that public was always itself structured in forms of dominance, that it relied on a certain kind of transaction between both elites and people we might call the professional middle class, people in the universities, journalists, their government officials and professionals, experts, to administer that public on behalf of the welfare of everyone. I think we have to be honest, and those of us in the university, that we have not always held up our end of that. We have, in many ways, not offered the most robust opposition to this withering of life possibilities. since the 1970s, the kind of hollowing out of social benefits, of mobility, of the regeneration of communities. It's been the case that it's not just elites, but even people in these other professional positions have often said relatively little to contest that, as unions have been hollowed out, as immigration policy has shifted. It's not just the right as such that's done that. I think there's deep skepticism that the people shaping and shepherding that public have also been somewhat complicit in it. So I think that's now, even though there is a kind of fracturing, part of the fracturing on all sides of the political spectrum is the withdrawal of consent to that group of people, the professional middle class, the managers, those tasked with trying to keep some sense of a public together. So I think it raises tough questions for us in the university, for activist intellectuals and others, about what role we'll play in trying to encourage people to reinvest in a different kind of public, where their lives and well-being is really taken seriously. And just the last thing, Obama in some ways captures this, because while on the one hand, he spoke in, deep and quite committed terms about that shared good through a language of civic nationalism, during his administration, the yawning gap between the very, very elite and the kind of 90% and really the people who were suffering the deepest forms of crisis only expanded. So I think there is some logic in a kind of rebellion against that order when people are asking, what am I getting in return for my consent for this greater public?
Mm-hmm. In your first book, Racial Propositions, you look at a series of ballot measures in California over the second half of the 20th century, basically. And you find in those electoral moments a kind of conservative undercurrent beneath the kind of liberal discourse of California. Can you talk a little bit about how that project has outfitted you to understand the current moment? How much do you mobilize your insights from that project as you think about the lay of the land in 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. That project was trying to think about why California, across much of the post-war era, which was the kind of, understood as the epicenter of progressive, liberal possibilities, good governance, efficiency, became the site of so many pretty explicitly not necessarily explicitly racist measures, but measures that absolutely reinforced racial hierarchy. So California in the 1940s rejected a fair employment initiative that would have outlawed racial discrimination in hiring, and in labor unions in the 60s made racial discrimination in housing a constitutionally protected practice. In the 70s overturned school desegregation measures. In the 80s passed English-only measures. In the 90s, passed immigration restriction measures, became the first state to outlaw public affirmative action, bilingual education, oversaw prison expansion. So the question there for me was, how is it that a state centered in the fullest expression of civic nationalism and democratic liberalism became the site of these? And I think that the assumption was somehow that an unsavory or conservative element had kind of played on people's fears, and so that it was actually an attempt to undermine this otherwise capacious, generous, liberal good. I think looking through these initiatives, part of what I realized, it was actually the language of liberalism itself, the language and the commitments of liberalism, which still relied on kind of individual judgments of morality, of, again, that weren't actually secured through collective structural democratic guarantees. It was about atomized individual judgment and tolerance that actually provided the language for many of those ballot initiatives to take place, such that realtors and homeowners could say, I bear no racial prejudice or religious prejudice to anyone. I simply want to allow homeowners the right to choose who they sell to. So it disavowed long, long structural histories of discrimination, of investments in racial discrimination and hierarchy, because it reduced it to individual sentiment and affect. And I think that's very much what's happening here, is that we don't have a language and analysis, even to critique Trumpism, beyond often the kind of individuated effects of the norm breaking, the kind of callousness, the boorish behavior, that we're continuing to lose a sense of how we understand structures and the remedies we need to address those structures, because the the individual orientations and behaviors seem so dramatically upsetting.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of atomization, is that the thing that makes liberalism so vulnerable to fascism in your view?
Yeah, and I think that's right. And it's, again, that it doesn't mobilize, and we don't have as a resource a certain kind of collective language that would understand in a more material way why our fates are often linked together. And it encourages instead, part of our notion of turning to this division between the figure of the producer and the parasite is that it always leaves open the possibility that someone is sacrificable, someone who's parasitic, who's degenerate, someone who will allow outside, even the notion of like the civic nation. And we can even see it replicated in social movements, oppositional social movements, when we think about a certain strain of immigrant rights discourse that appeals to policymakers and the public on the grounds that immigrants are not criminals, they're hard workers, they're taxpayers, they're contributors. That absolutely leaves open that category of people who actually deserve to be expelled, even within immigrant communities.
Right. It's like the 19th century formulation of the deserving poor.
Absolutely, yes, that's recurring. So I think that's also organized many of our political movements that are trying to gain some possibility for people who are facing crisis, who only end up reproducing its terms. So in the book, we talk about labor-led struggle in Ohio in 2011 to protect collective bargaining rights, which the governor, John Kasich, had proposed in a legislation to take away. And the coalition that led this, understandably to appeal to voters, said, look, if you attack us, we're the firefighters, the emergency workers, the first responders, the nurses. We do the heroic producerist work. You've mistaken us. We are not parasitic. We are the producers. The challenge with that, and it worked, they defeated this legislation and preserved collective bargaining rights, but of course we can see the limitations here. All of us increasingly can't claim that, and it's also a deeply gendered notion of producerism, that our possibility in the world is premised on our ability to appeal to others, that we're producers and not parasites. We're all parasitic in some sense. That's the history of this country. So we have to think about a language that acknowledges that and that doesn't make that category of like the heroic, tax-paying, patriot-loving producer the kind of only guarantee for some form of social protection and possibility. And that work is not, that's bottom-up work where social movements have to mobilize new language to narrate their claims to the public good.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier the failures of the academy to produce what's needed or to produce something more usable on behalf of the public. On the one hand, that's, I think, an unassailable fact that the academy has failed in certain ways. On the other hand, it's also true, and it's kind of fascinating, and for the kind of work that you and I do, it's definitely the case that you can turn on your TV and hear on the nightly news a kind of racial discourse that's rooted in the kinds of insights that were being hashed out around seminar tables in universities 25 years ago. So certain things about dog whistle politics, for example, or even the social construction of race. There's certain ideas that were hammered out in the academy and that have become mainstreamed in our public discourse. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of public intellectual work in the setting of the modern university, but also in this contemporary moment of seemingly endless crisis? How do you think about your own intellectual work outward-looking from the university? And I know you also have a background as an organizer. Can you talk a little bit about the continuities or discontinuities between doing organizing work and doing public intellectual work?
That's a really important reminder that the move here is not to be cynical about the role that university-based scholars and researchers and students have played and might play in renewed and rejuvenated possibilities. And, in our fields of ethnic studies, Black studies, the push to make claims on the university that those become scholarly fields, legitimated intellectual inquiries, came from broad-based social movements. It wasn't simply about adding to the curriculum or majors. It was a central part, just as housing desegregation, employment desegregation, anti-war activity. The transformation of the university was central, and you're absolutely right that there's been long and important traditions, feminist traditions, traditions in queer studies, labor studies, in which intellectual projects have been closely tethered to social movements and oppositional politics, contestations. I think increasingly, though, and this is not to just single out the university, but as those larger formations have become demobilized, as all of us lack these shared traditions of collective action, through union, through feminist organizations, queer organizations, think of ACT UP in the 80s and 90s. The public intellectual from the university perspective has increasingly been the one who publishes a clever opinion editorial in a national newspaper, who offers engaging but otherwise individuated sound bites in the context of a national debate. We don't have the same sets of relationships to actual collective people in motion. I'm not suggesting it's just the university-based intellectuals that have withdrawn from that, but I'm saying when public intellectual work only circulates really in these individuated ways, it does lay the groundwork for more and more people outside the university to ask, and certainly with kind of changes in higher education, its costs, its inaccessibility, where people are increasingly asking, what role does the university serve for me? And that's the ground, I think, on which a lot of the kind of like anti-intellectualism and attacks on the university emerge from. So I think we all have work to do to figure out how we forge again our connections to those constituencies and places.
Mm-hmm. What are the things on the landscape that give you the most hope, or that maybe promise is a better way of putting it? What are the things that are happening now, the formations you see, the ideas you're privy to, the groups or organizations that you see at work out there on the landscape? What are the things that give you a vision of a way out?
Yeah, that's a really important question to reflect on. I might point to three. We talk in the book a little bit about an organization called the Rural Organizing Project in Oregon, which has for 25 years worked in rural communities around issues of racial justice, gender justice, the incursion of right-wing formations. More recently, they've really turned their attention to helping largely but not exclusively white rural Oregonians think about the relationship between the crises they're facing, as I suggested, the closing of local libraries, the kind of emaciation of services, jobs, et cetera, to immigrant communities, to immigrant detention, to other forms of structural racism. So really doing that, they call it kitchen table work in linking those things together. And that's happening in many, many places. People have this really singular image of like rural America as somehow just only aligned with conservative politics. There's a lot of people doing really grassroots movement building work to do the linking and relationality between rural places and larger crises. So I think that's one example that's really rich with possibility. I think the second, if we think about the turn that we've observed in the last 10 years in particular in relation to mass incarceration and the kind of growing rebellion against punishment as the obvious and only way to address social crises. And most of that work originated with loved ones of people who were incarcerated, people who were then released, to bring this crisis to the public's attention and insist that another kind of way was possible. And you've seen now the politics grow such that even people on the right, even Trump himself, wants to claim some part of this. We can no longer rely on mass incarceration. So I think that's a critical area that we have to acknowledge has really transformed and shows us some lessons about linking people together. And then the third I would say is there's a lot of really compelling work now around public goods. Free public transportation, higher education, the environment itself, the Green New Deal, healthcare. that really is important because it's in the wake of a relentless 40-year effort to argue that privatization, market solutions, and austerity are the only way that social goods can be allocated. And the fact that there's just rebellion against that everywhere is something we really should attend to and take up. And for me, is most personified in the teacher strikes in Chicago, in LA, also in West Virginia, the kind of red state strikes as well, people arguing and making claims for the public good. So I think there actually is a lot of very local, really animated work that can excite us and give us models for how we might move into the future.
Mm-hmm. When you and Joe were working on your book, did you talk to folks in the Proud Boys and groups like that?
Yeah, we interviewed really the founder of this very well-known group in the Pacific Northwest, Patriot Prayer, Joey Gibson, Asian American. We were really trying to understand his politics. He talked about how the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins in 1960 really stood into him for the kind of like bravery and kind of militant populism and willingness to stand up to state violence that really organized his politics, which are on the far right. He also talks about kind of Dr. King and his influence there. So this wasn't to offer a more sympathetic narrative to those groups, but it is to understand how they're also in this process of formation and figuring out and drawing from multiple traditions. We went to Trump rallies, we went to militia rallies. So the project itself is certainly not a deep ethnographic dive into those places, and a lot of that exchange also happens online, and there's other work that does that. But I think what we did want to hold is rather than just imagining these as fully formed, the way like Charlottesville stood in, like it's just the same old racist white nationalism. And again, it's not to indemnify it or to underestimate the impact it's having on people, but it is to talk that it's actually much more dynamic in its formation. And that's partly what we were trying to get at in doing that work.
Yeah. So for someone like Joey Gibson, what is the future that he thinks he's fighting for? What is from the 1960s sit-ins to the far right, it's just it's an odd trajectory in my humble opinion. So what is the vision that he would express of the future that he's fighting for?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's difficult to distill to a singular kind of like political orientation. So at one moment, you can hear him and others talk about a criticism of Big Pharma and the drug companies and corporate power in general. You can hear them talking sometimes actually about mass incarceration and the war on drugs. At the same time, you can also, I think what links them and why they have a relationship to fascism is they're very much understand that a certain kind of demonization and the expulsion of any social formations on the left, protesters, whether it's immigrant rights protesters, labor unions, feminists, they're actually the culprits of deterioration of a public that they're trying to constitute. So that's partly how they both can have this blended politics, but also their vision is unmistakably fascist in that they absolutely imagine this kind of purging and expulsion of different sectors of the populace as a way to address the crisis.
Mm-hmm. And where do they fall? How do they map onto the kind of urban-rural divide that so structures our politics right now? Are these folks from the countryside?
No, they actually draw, their own members come from lots of different social locations and backgrounds. So the militia groups, which are different than groups like Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys, tend to be both based in rural communities, and their politics are organized around a particular criticism of the federal government, particularly in the West, and the land under federal control, and how those patterns of land ownership have undermined the capacities of these communities to support and rejuvenate themselves. But you'll often see connections between the militia groups and groups like Patriot Prayer. Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys are really post-Trump phenomenon. They kind of inhabit a kind of street Trumpism, which is they actually don't then have to harbor or invoke any long-term political goals. They actually live their politics out through confrontations with the groups like Antifa and others on the left. It's through those kind of acts of street violence that their politics become realized.
Mm-hmm. How important is Antifa in your view?
So for them, Antifa stands in for not just the limitations, but the absolute kind of, in their terms, the lunacy of collective projects, collective goods, when life is not just subject to marketized, militarized, patriarchal conditions. Antifa is like the kind of culmination or the expression of that. So that's partly why I think they become the object of their violence, and they have this really important role. And then certainly in other places like Charlottesville, where Antifa protesters were really critical in facing down the white supremacists there, they summon a different kind of tradition of being able to name fascist tendencies and formations across lots of different places.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we are clearly seeing in our politics is the Republican Party getting ready for minoritarian rule in a lot of different ways. I mean, the voter suppression and the gerrymandering, and there are just a number of ways that it's clear. People have been talking for almost a whole generation about great demographic shift that's going to spell the end of the old GOP. They are not going quietly. They are getting ready for minoritarian rule, and I'm curious what you see as the most important kinds of work we can be doing to head that off.
I think one thing, when we were at Trump rallies in 2016 and we talked to people there, the Bernie Sanders campaign also had a really vibrant presence in Oregon, as it did in many other places. That we noticed is the number of people who came from a Sanders rally to a Trump rally. And some of this has been documented in exit polls. So
I saw that a lot when I was doing documentary work around the Occupy movement. Mm-hmm. You would see a lot of Ron Paul supporters hanging out at Zuccotti Park.
Absolutely. So I don't mean to romanticize that or to suggest that there's not attractions to the same forms of violence and hierarchy. Because one had some identification with the Sanders campaign doesn't mean that they're not somehow, capable of being recruited into the forms of Trumpism we know. But I guess I am saying that it's to remind us that the politics are indeed quite open at this moment, that even the GOP itself, the notion of its long-term strategy, I understand actually is far more provisional, improvisational, suturing together different segments in these very tentative ways. So I don't understand it as something that's fully formed as much as the work that's happening in rural communities. Those are places that often supported Trump, continue to support him, and yet are also open to possibilities of thinking about why immigrant rights and immigrant detention matters to former logging communities or coal communities. So I guess I'm saying we should be careful not to either concede or imagine as fully formed some of these political impulses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wish we had?
The last thing I would say is that many times in writing this book, we were just disoriented. We didn't quite know what to make of these moves we're seeing. The presence, for example, of several deeply popular African-American hosts on Breitbart radio, far-right radio. And again, not just because they indemnified Breitbart listeners against accusations of racism, but because they were understood as critical thinkers in a kind of far-right anti-status project. The president of the Heritage Foundation, the most deeply influential right-wing formation across the last 40 years, is a black woman now. Doesn't change any orientation of the Heritage Foundation's politics, who supports it, et cetera. But they understand that there's a linking with a certain kind of incorporation of black subjectivity into deeply conservative politics. Think about Trump's ad during the Super Bowl, where he celebrated himself for offering clemency to a black woman who had been incarcerated for 20 years on a nonviolent drug conviction. The response from his base was not, why are you helping them? You should be helping us. It was actually to understand it as a testimony, a kind of an indicator of his deep commitment and capacity to take on the worst excesses of the state. All of these kind of mystifying moves could actually give us some hope that if we commit to figuring out and engaging in a new politics, putting out projects that imagine collective possibility and connection, that there's actually much more support to that than we might otherwise think. And I think the fact that the right is actually quite dynamic in doing this is in some ways an invitation for others that don't share those values to not just assume that our political world is as atomized and closed off as we might otherwise think.
Yeah. No, I think that that's really one of the most important things that comes out of your book is that there would be a tendency, I think, to misread the head of the Heritage Foundation, for example, as kind of simple window dressing, and it's not that. It's something much deeper, and I think that you're onto it. When it is a reorientation of what right-wing politics are in this moment. That it calls for a different analysis, which you've offered us, but it suggests a different way forward.
Yeah, and it's certainly not to underestimate the impact that right-wing policies in particular have on communities of color, on Black communities, on Indigenous communities. That's not the point. The point is that even in these moments when far-right politics seem such a kind of return to an earlier period, let's say the earlier 20th century of kind of white nationalism, that move actually misses the kind of underlying dynamism and its capacity to incorporate signifiers of racial difference into its broader project.